In this episode of the California Probation Connection, Chief Mark Bonini from Amador County delves into some of the recent justice reforms, how and why they were created, probation's role, and the impact these reforms have today. All right, well, welcome to the California Probation Connection. I appreciate you joining us today. Chief Bonini from Amador, you are our first one-on-one podcast, so you're going to have to carry a lot of discussion here today. Are you ready for that?
I'll do my best, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. We're really looking forward to it. Today we're going to talk about the art of successful reform and how to do it, and what our role is in it. So we've seen a lot of reform over the years here in California, a lot in the last decade. In criminal justice. And so, but not all reforms are made equal, or created equal. We've had things like SB 678, AB 109, known as public safety realignment, Prop 57. Maybe we can talk about those things today, and why we supported various different ones and maybe why we didn't in other areas. So I would love to just jump in by asking, what were some of the most critical moments you remember about these different things? Start wherever you want to. Like, there's been so many different pieces to it. What's been the most memorable to you?
Well, for me, becoming chief when I did, it seemed like with SB 678, I was a newer chief. I kind of was along for the ride, so to speak. And then when AB 109 came along, I had a few years under my belt, and I felt much more connected with what was occurring and how it was occurring. And I was part of the executive committee of CPOC at that time. So that's the one reform that really, other than Prop 57, just because I was involved with that as CPOC president. But AB 109 was really such a critical piece of legislation. And the way we were able to get involved in it, the way that the governor, he had a significant problem at that time. It was really no joke. There was a 3-judge panel. Overcrowding was an issue. We were looking at offenders being released, and ultimately to sit down and have that collaborative effort at the state level, not only was just a great experience from a chief's perspective, and a chief that is a small county chief, but ultimately it was very memorable. And I think, as far as I can tell, I think it's working. It's early on we referred to offenders that were under that umbrella as AB 109ers, and some other things that some other ways we referred to that group. But ultimately, when everything played out, I think the offenders and the populations we supervise, they're just the populations we supervise. I don't hear many in the business referring to those types of offenders as AB 109ers anymore.
It's interesting to hear you talk about kind of the trajectory of some of those. And, we kind of came into CPOC around the same time, me as the executive director and you as chief, although you have many more years of probation experience under your belt than I do. But
and you on the legislative side, many more years experience on that side than I do. So very good. It was an even fit.
We were a good team. That's how I see it. But the, the AB 109 experience, now that we look back on it, we're talking 10 plus years ago that it happened, which is crazy to me. But, it's a good thing to try to dissect now, like what worked, what didn't, why did that work? And that's why kind of thinking about how do you make reform work is so important to probation. We're constantly in the middle of the various reforms. So you mentioned that there was a big problem and the 3-judge panel. And I don't know that everybody remembers some of that, and I think that's really important. It wasn't really, we wanted change for the sake of change, or we don't like how things are going. There was a 3-judge panel that was ready to literally look at flinging the doors open because the constitutional care was abysmal inside of the prison system. And CPOC and others actually intervened in that case, legally filed. And that was a new thing for us. We had never done that. So it was a really kind of treacherous area for you as a chief to kind of wade into, for us as an organization. 10 years now later, we're still doing it. We're still getting on down the road. So is there something specific to how that reform came about, that you would credit kind of some of the success around how we were able to implement?
I think looking back and being in the position with CPOC that I was in, I wasn't as intimately involved at the time. Chief Pinner and Chief Powers, both since retired, I think were the integral pieces in that, and really kept the chiefs together, kept us briefed. I think the communication that occurred between the governor's office and our partners, state sheriffs, Cal chiefs, CSAC, and any of those, I just really think back and was in awe of how Chief Penner was able to convey the message, both the problem and the solution, worked through and negotiated things. And I'm sure you were right there too, but to the negotiations that occurred to make things happen the way they really needed to happen. And probably the biggest piece of that was the smartest piece of it, was to look at the probation chiefs and make us the chair of the Community Corrections Partnership. I think if anyone else was the chair of that, I think there would have been problems. And then it was really the governor saying to the counties, look, you need to figure that I have this problem, but I want you locally to figure it out, come up with a plan, and you do it at your level for what works for you. We, the state, aren't going to tell you how to do it. And I think that was also integral in how things played out. So those plans were put into place. Locals were, forced, although many locals do a great job of coming to the table and talking, they were forced to come to the table and talk, work through issues, and speaking to my county there in Amador. My sheriff was involved in state sheriffs. My DA was involved in CDAA, and they both eventually were president at one point. My chair at the time, my supervisor ended up being the president of CSAC at one point during kind of all of this occurring over the last 10 years. And getting those folks, and I credit them a lot, to really look at the issue rather than the money. For us locally was very important. It was here is this population that's coming your way. Who's going to do what with it? And once we figure out who's going to do what with it, we'll assign positions, dollars, funding to whatever it is that we really need. So that local aspect and the way we solve the problems, and we're allowed to solve the problems locally rather than have the state come in and tell us how it's done, made all the difference in the world with such a big reform.
That's a really important point, right? I mean, not only communication, it really fostered the communication locally, which I think in fairness, we know didn't always happen, right? We often worked in silos. So there was, maybe that's a positive of something that came from it. It did kind of force those conversations, force us to the table to figure out solutions. And then I'm hearing communication between the state and the locals to try to implement something that would actually work for everybody, and that's, as you said, not an easy thing. And I agree, kind of sitting there, being a part of some of that, it was a heavy lift. It takes a lot of work. And I think it underscores one of the things that I would say is really important to making reform successful. And that is communication. And that is communication, not just, it's often hard to get something passed. I think it's harder to make something work that's passed. And that's one of the things that, after 10 years, we're constantly going back and tweaking and looking at, what needs to be done around AB 109. So that's, I think a lot of people, probably, hopefully our staff listening to some of this may not have really even known some of the reasons why AB 109 kind of came about. So, so I appreciate you kind of sharing a little bit of that. Well, you mentioned you were president in 2016. So yeah, you're laughing like, was it that long ago? And so lucky you, and I know, having served as executive director now for over 15 years, you never really know what's going to happen the year that you're president. When you sign up to get into the chairs, it's a few years ahead of time, so you don't really know what's coming your way. You had a very interesting year because you did something that really the probation as a profession, CPOC as an association, really had never done before, and that was get in very deeply into an election cycle, into the proposition. So talk a little bit about the experience around how Prop 57 came about and what our role was in kind of getting that through.
Yeah, you don't know what you're going to get into in any given year, and 2016 was that kind of year that I think really thrust us, the chief probation officers of California, and you refer to me, but you too, when it came to this occurring, you were right there the whole time, and the chiefs and the discussions that took place. Again, I think at the time there was a problem, and the governor, knowing that we were the ones that could get it done because of AB 109, because of SB 678 prior to that, I think the governor realized that we're an ally, and we're uniquely positioned within the criminal justice system, that and he had the confidence in us to come and talk to us and say, how can we solve this last problem before he's done being governor. He really was looking at a way to put an indeterminate spin on a determinate sentence. And I think Prop 57 does that. It did three things, and it did really three simple things. It put that spin at the end of the sentence, in that an offender that's in CDCR could get to the parole board sooner than they ever could. But getting to the parole board and getting parole are really two different things.
That's a good point.
So it got them to the parole board, where the parole board is made up of mostly retired law enforcement, personnel, staff of varying levels. Mm-hmm. Yes, they're appointed by the governor, but nonetheless, you get to them, you complete your case, and if on paper and during that interview, it looks like you've done the things that they would be looking for to grant you parole, so be it. Taking a step beyond that, Prop 57 took away the direct filing that the DAs, the district attorneys, were able to do prior to Prop 57. That to me was going to be the heavy lift, because right. we're justice partners, and I think we want to play nice in the sandbox, but whenever you take someone's discretion away, it makes it difficult. But frankly, the DAs didn't really have too much heartburn over that. Even my DA, it never was a topic locally. Mm-hmm. And then rolling into credits and how CDCR could potentially award credits to inmates that are doing programs. They're not just sitting in their cell breathing. They're doing things that are positive, things that are rehabilitative, even though limited as they were then as far as programming in CDCR. Still figuring out a way to award credits and recognize that. And if you want to call them extra credits, so be it. But still, you're earning credits rather than just getting credits. And those are really two different things. And I think any correctional administrator, because sheriffs have ran jails forever, they've always been able to award credits as an administrator how they want to award them beyond what the law says. But why wouldn't we want to do that at CDCR? Why wouldn't we want to allow the infrastructure and the administrators to come up with a schema to do that and proportionally award credits that they saw fit. And they had to go to public hearings to do all that as well. So it wasn't like they were just doing it in a vacuum. Right. So those really were the three tenets of 57.
And, I know you have that down because you actually accompanied Governor Brown on the campaign trail. Right. to try to get this this understood, or better understood. And one of the things that I found super interesting about the whole experience, looking back at it, for us, all policymaking has some level of politicking involved, right? And, we've even talked on this podcast already a little bit about how probation chiefs are not elected officials. We oftentimes aren't in the politics side of the realm, even though we have to be kind of understanding it and kind of navigate it. And oftentimes an election cycle doesn't really, they're looking for sound bites, right? And probation's work, the probation's mission oftentimes doesn't fit a sound bite very easily. But this particular piece of law, I don't think could have been successful without probation's kind of explanation, even in the nuance about what it means, what you just explained. And to have the governor feel like that was something that was needed actually in an election context was something very different for us. And so for a moment, at least, talk a little bit about that, what that was like being on the election trail. Not many probation chiefs have that opportunity.
Right. And it's funny, when I talk to chiefs or when we have trainings for subordinate staff or whatever the case may be, someone will mention, kind of phrase it how you just phrased it, that I hit the campaign trail with the governor.
Right.
I ended up wherever the governor was. I didn't get the special treatment that he got when it comes to, being the governor of the state of California.
As he should.
He could drive out, on the tarmac and hop on a plane and go. I was the one that had to get there 2 hours early, park my car, get to where I needed to get to,
so
and ensure that I was there.
So it's not glorious is the way you're trying to.
It's not glorious. But again, it was well worth it. The experience, I would never, throw away ever, going through that. And it was great. The friends that were made, the rest of the CPOC staff, Diane Cummins, and her expertise and the way that she can explain and give a historical perspective, as well as, going forward, how this works and what it's going to mean. It made things much easier for me because, and frankly, Governor Brown, he can explain things, and his demeanor was such that it really had a calming effect on everyone in the room, whether it was the LA Times or whether it was the Sacramento Bee or the littlest paper, or, there was one time that I made my way down to a discussion in Southern California out in San Bernardino County, and I was the sole person there with regard to Prop 57, but it was important to make those contacts. So it was very interesting and enlightening to get the governor's take on things and to get the historical perspective from Diane, and to have those two really team up and be able to do what they did. I don't know that there could have been really anyone else that could have done that and given that perspective that they could give at every phase and every question. It was very intriguing. I had a lot of fun. But again, sitting in traffic, he would hop in the car with CHP and buzz down the lane. It was a challenge at times.
It was a little different experience, and understood. And it's interesting to hear you describe it. So just so folks know, Diane Cummins was a special advisor to the governor at the time, and really was. She's done a lot in her career, but was very instrumental in kind of making sure that AB 109 was implemented in a way that was responsive to what we were learning on the ground as to what was happening. And then, of course, obviously accompanied the governor in a lot of the policy development around Prop 57. Although I have to say, and I was not in the rooms as often as you were with the governor, I have been in the rooms on other times with him on other things. A calming influence is not how I would describe Governor Brown, and in any he demands a lot for the policy discussion, and oftentimes those are really robust. But on the campaign trail, trying to make sure people understand, maybe a little bit of a different demeanor. Because he was really masterful in trying to communicate a message, and a tough one, right? This was kind of a tough message. It sometimes kind of fought against what most people thought they understood about the system. And so I know it's probably one of the reasons why, you were Chief of the Year from us, because that was a lot that you had to do to kind of make that happen. And so we appreciate it. And it was really kind of a culmination. You talk about 678, SB 678 being kind of the foundation, in getting very probation specific, getting us ready with evidence-based practices, kind of being sure that we're kind of thinking through how to change behavior and what works. AB 109 and then Prop 57. I guess I really hadn't thought about that as a progression. I mean, is that kind of how it rolled out locally? Is that how you see it as you look back?
I do. And for me, from the local perspective, because again, chiefs with CPOC, we have the state perspective and what goes on. And then we also we're held to answer locally.
Right.
And for me, it was easy to explain and to show success that we had under 678. And then it was easy to explain and show the successes we had locally under AB 109. Prop 57, though, was also different locally in that I had, even though I was president of CPOC and I was carrying the chief's message at the state level and going out on the campaign trail, locally, I had my board against it, my board of supervisors against it. I had my district attorney against it, my sheriff against it. So, there were times where I find myself on the opposite side of the aisle from them, not very often. And this was a huge one.
Yeah.
I always remember that year we talked quite a bit about threading the needle when we had to talk about things and really explain. And I use that in a positive way because while publicly my board and again, my DA and my sheriff may have been against Prop 57, when we would talk to each other, they understood the niche, if you will, that it really filled and why we were doing the things that we were doing.
Why do you think that is? Because I imagine that was very difficult to do. Although I think a great testament that sometimes you can have disagreements on things,
Right.
But yet still continue to work together. And that certainly seemed to be the case in Amador. But is there anything that you would attribute to that?
I think it just comes back to being able to communicate with each other and small counties, big counties, medium-sized counties. It's so important to be able to pick up the phone and talk to that person directly and, explain what is going on or why this is happening or why it isn't happening and hearing it from the horse's mouth. I just being communicative to everything that's going on. And, while you hold your cards close to your chest, in some cases, I think there's other areas that, you need to be very transparent and honest and forthright and being able to agree to disagree at times.
So we've talked about the reforms that kind of we've been really instrumental in either developing or helping to craft a solution, supporting. What about when we don't always support, the various reforms or even think, that they may be going in the right direction. So, talk a little bit about maybe how do we make reform successful when we weren't supportive of it, and what kind of challenges are presented to probation when we're kind of put in that situation?
I think what it comes down to, again, even though the communication didn't occur early on, or frankly, we just don't think that whatever the reform is will work. We have that track record of being the ones to get things done. And when all is said and done, if it's law, it's law, and we need to do what we need to do. And if it means making lemonade out of lemons, probation does that.
That's true.
I was just having a discussion today locally about a situation, and we're the ones that are going to carry the water. I just, maybe we all have the same problem, that we all have a problem saying no, but and we've done it a lot this year. We're opposed to quite a few things. I don't recall many years where we've come out as opposed as to as many things as we have this year, but
it's true.
It's well thought out. And I really think that saying no is powerful and has an important message behind it when it's appropriate. And ultimately, when things come our way, the system many times looks at us to figure out and to maneuver and to really get it done and bring our partners, both justice and on the Health and Human Services side, together to really make sure that when all is said and done, what we've done is tried to do our best with what was given to us. Because again, when they don't communicate with the experts or the boots on the ground, what comes out, again, maybe lemons, but ultimately we need to figure it out in the name of public safety.
Goes back to communication, I
Right.
guess, right? Whether you're, opposed to something or not. And, it's interesting. You said something powerful, about saying no sometimes is powerful. And you're right. This year, in particular, I think we've probably had more times where we have said no, and we don't like to do that, honestly, right? I mean, you've been around the table, you know how your colleagues feel about it, and it's probably reflective of exactly what you're saying with those local conversations. It's really not a comfortable place for us to be, but it's important sometimes, right? I mean, and talk a little bit about that. Why is it important for probation's point of view, voice to be heard in policymaking in and around criminal justice, juvenile justice? What is it that we bring to the table that's different?
Well, it seems like many times, both the legislature, our local politicians, heck, I was talking to one of my officers today where his brother doesn't even quite understand what he does. And he's been a probation officer for 12 years.
Right.
It's difficult to explain the things that we do and we get involved with. We don't have a TV show or had a TV show out there like Cops that,
right.
It's very clear cut what a deputy sheriff does or what a police officer does. There's been a few, parole agent shows, but again, I think their capacity and what they do is limited, where our sphere of influence is really across the board. It's from, and especially now, it's from pretrial or right after arrest all the way through
right.
up to 5 years beyond sentencing. And really, in many cases, it could be even beyond that if the offender's sent to prison and then comes out on PRCS, post-release community supervision, one of our caseloads. So while law enforcement, frontline law enforcement many times has a point-in-time contact with an offender, usually at their worst moment in their lives, we may have contact with that offender for many, many years to come. And I think that really is a differentiator in how we do business, not only with those that we supervise, but then we have the ancillary pieces where we're coming up with programming to deal with this situation. And many times that comes with funding to do that, but many times, frankly, it doesn't. And we have to figure out how to, squeeze that grape even more so locally to get as much as we can out of every dollar.
Yeah.
So then we're the ones at the table where, we arrest this person, we put him back in custody. Now we've got to turn and advocate for them to get into this program, or we need to advocate for them to go on GPS so they can get back to work. We're trying to hold offenders accountable, all the while ensuring that we're also holding them accountable to rehabilitative programs. So again, I don't think there's anyone else that's as uniquely positioned in the system as we are, and how we can flow back from the health and human services side of things back to full-on law enforcement, where really, we're dressed and we look just like any other officer on the street. And many times we have to do those things. It just is what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes it, and we have another podcast episode that's talking a little bit about just that, the modern probation officer, and how diverse the skill set is that goes into that. So I guess it does make sense as to why, from a policy perspective, we may find ourselves sometimes really agreeing with some of our law enforcement partners and kind of being in lockstep with some of that, while at the same time maybe being on the opposite side of where they are, a la Prop 57 that we talked about a little bit earlier. So, it does stand to reason with as many different things that we're doing and responsible for in the system, that we maybe understand some of the unintended consequences of that policy, perhaps, in a different phase of the system. So we would have a different, philosophy or position on some of these policies. So, that is very interesting. I want to go back to your time talking about Prop 57 and those relationships for a little bit. You talked a lot about going to different places like editorial boards, for example, and talking about policy. That's a little bit of a different forum than, for example, talking in a legislative setting or anything else that we had done before. What was that like? What surprised you about that interaction, or what types of things that they would be looking for, or what moved them? Just curious as to how you felt about that.
I think when I recall sitting back at those editorial boards, I was again, I was surprised, but not surprised that they didn't understand, our position. They didn't understand what we did. And I felt like many times what I did when I would speak at one of those, or when I would be on a panel or whatever the case may be, I would start out by explaining what a probation officer does. And then I would take it from there. And I think that would really wrap the package for them. Governor Brown made it easy when it came to my turn to chime in on certain issues. So did Diane, frankly. But I think that was the thing that struck me was how little they knew about probation, and us being there, I think, was important for us to be there, in that it allowed us the opportunity to get out in front of everyone. And this is what we do. I think the other piece that was interesting was I felt like they understood that probation officers had compassion and loved what they did, and were able to do and put on those different hats when it came to dealing with offenders. I think the groups, the editorial boards and the groups, valued that.
That's really interesting to hear. I'm not sure we've talked about that, actually. And it's so important. It seems like at the heart of a lot of what we talk about around the table, right? And trying to figure out, how do we communicate our message? How do people really understand? And those things that you just explained are probably the most important thing. Like, if we can only have people understand those pieces of it, I think a lot of the other things kind of tend to fall into place. Right. So that's that. I apologize taking us back to that, but that was one of the things that I thought, wait, I'd be really curious to know what was that like. Going back to, can you think of a time where we were asked to do or implement a reform and it just didn't work? I mean, we often hear, we're not going to let it fail. We're going to make the lemonade out of the lemons, for example. But is there something that was really problematic in your mind, and we just dissected 109 and why maybe it did work? Wonder if there's anything that didn't on your mind that we would dissect to see why it didn't.
I don't have anything offhand that I can think of that didn't work. I mean, I have questions about some of the reforms that have occurred over the last year or two that I'm wondering how it's going to play out, because, in a couple of those, we either weren't involved or we weren't involved, and that communication didn't occur that we talked about early on with the experts. And now we're kind of left with the bag to figure out and how to make it work. So those really are the ones going forward. AB 1950, I think, while a reform and didn't necessarily require us to do much implementation, it really changed the game. When you have offenders that you had 3 years, 4 years, 5 years on probation, and now it's a 2-year grant for a felony and a 1-year grant for a misdemeanor, it really speeds up the clock. And I almost fear like it speeds the clock up so much that we're not going to really have the time invested in this person to see some behavior change that will last. We may see some short-term behavior change, but that's really different than ultimately what you want to get, that long-lasting, concrete and grounded behavior change. It just doesn't happen that quick.
That's a great point. Change does not happen that quick. That's a really, really good point, whether it's for systems or for people. Right. And so, it makes me wonder if having less time to really address the rehabilitation side of things, does that then kind of start lean more towards, well, then we really have to just be sure we're digging in on the accountability and the enforcement piece. I mean, I think that's a dangerous unintended consequence of not having enough time to really meaningfully work with folks in a way that kind of brings about sustainable change. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's something we're going to have to see. I think it's something we're going to have to guard against, Right.
And I think along those same lines, although on the juvenile side of things, SB 823. I mean, frankly, for me, being a chief in a small county, I don't have a juvenile hall or a youth detention facility that I have to worry about. However, I have to contract for those beds in case I do have one of my juveniles get themselves in trouble and my judge just decides to send that juvenile into that process. Mm-hmm. So I think for us not to be as involved as we were with AB 109, as we were with 678, as we were with 57, and to really get SB 23 thrust upon us with really a very vulnerable piece of our population. I mean, kids, these kids, and in many cases, young adults, are the ones that have the highest risk, highest need, that frankly, in the past, chiefs have come together when the closure of the Division of Juvenile Justice has come up at the state level. We've fought back and said, we need you to take this very limited piece of the population,
right,
and they need your help to now turn that on its head, and in such a short time, move that to the counties, not only going forward with kids that will be committed, but ultimately we're going to have to take those kids back from the DJJ institutions. Not that there's that many, but those kids and young adults that are there can have severe impacts on how things are happening locally. And when I see my chiefs, see my fellow chiefs, grappling with the issue, the high users of DJJ, or just the one that chief knows is in DJJ and is thinking to themselves, how am I going to ensure that I have rehabilitative programs locally, ensure that I'm addressing that juvenile's needs educationally, ensure that I'm addressing their needs behaviorally, and then ultimately I have to ensure public safety of both that juvenile and the juveniles that are in the institution with them. It's hard to see, and many times I get a little bit angry when I think of how it was rolled out, how we weren't consulted at a level that I feel like we should have been consulted, and then ultimately not having Sacramento clear the field for us. I think we needed leadership to say, as we did with AB 109 when they made us the chair of the CCP, say probation is the agency, the department locally that's going to handle this, and they're going to handle it locally. Everyone else pretty much needs to back off. And I know I'm making that very simplistic, but we really needed that from Sacramento, and now even more so going forward, we continue to need it. And I'm crossing my fingers that Sacramento is going to be there for us to help us.
Well, it ties to what you said earlier about what makes it successful reform, right? And that's communication, and when maybe the concepts or the ideas get muddled because the communication isn't, kind of clear, and you do need to have clear lines as to who is going to be held responsible for things happening. And oftentimes it's hard because that's placed on our shoulders, but when it's not placed on our shoulders and maybe it's a little bit less clear, that also has different types of anxiety producing kind of situations. And you're right. I mean, we hear it from the other chiefs as well. We will step up and figure out some of the problem and a way to best handle it, because the youth really need our leadership, right, at the local level to do that. So we're seeing that happen, but we're also seeing how much, anxiety and unnecessary kind of work to try to fix things on the back end. And that's, I think, when you can see reform fail, even a good idea. Even if it's a good idea, you see reform fail when some of those pieces are in place. So, yeah, I do worry a little bit about it. You're right. You're projecting a lot of what we're hearing around the table as well. But we also know that we've been asked to do things before that we weren't really sure would work or how it would work, and we try to find a way to make that happen. I suspect that will be the case here. I just think it'll be a lot harder than it maybe needed to be.
Right, and I just, again, I feel for my fellow chiefs, and just the ancillary noise that it's many times it's overwhelming, and
right.
Really we spent too much time dealing with that noise when we could have really spent the time that the precious time we had, because it wasn't infinite. It was a finite amount of time when the intake closes, DJJ closes altogether. These kids need to go back. We really needed to use every ounce of that time in planning, programming, all the things that we need to take care of. And frankly, we spent a lot of time fending off others and other people that thought they had better ideas or could do things that we could do. And it just isn't there. I don't think they understand what we do. but they don't have the capacity to deal with these kids
Right.
and the youth that are coming back to us. So
Yeah, I mean, it's the difference between kind of people, the doers, and people who like need to really have a voice at the table to help make sure that the doers are kind of keeping everything, in mind. I mean, certainly not, I don't hear you saying that, we're the ones with all the answers and nobody
Sure.
else has them,
No.
but ultimately the people who have to be involved with kind of the development of the reform,
Right.
of the solution to the reform. And I think that's been a consistent message we've been hearing from the chiefs on all of the podcast discussions and just around our table. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. And reform for reform's sake,
Yeah.
it doesn't make any sense.
So
And I
true.
think and maybe you're going to get to this later, but it just seems like from Prop 57 in 2016, I can't believe it's been 6 years.
Yeah.
Things go by, so it happens so fast. And I can't believe AB 109, is a little over 10 years ago. But these reforms come at us so fast. It would be great if we could just take a breath and stop tinkering with the system, unless there's something glaring. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
But these subtleties, if you will, in many cases, it just feels like now would be the time to let the locals get their feet under themselves, and let's even get our foot off the gas for a little bit with reforms, and let's see what is working and what isn't working, and then tweak it from there.
Well, it's it's a great point, right? I mean, well, we're preaching to the choir
Right,
here, right?
right.
I realize that, but heck, it's our podcast. We can preach to the choir here. But I think that that's what strikes me again as missing. It's that conversation. We've done so much change in California. I mean, I think some people know that, and some people are concerned about it, right? We hear a lot about that. But I think some people don't think any of the stuff that we have been doing for, as you just now documented, over a decade, major reforms to the system, major reforms to the culture of the system. And shouldn't we be sure that that's going in the right and intended direction, and measure it, and then, as you say, tweak it. If something's glaring, obviously we're going to always have to be addressing those quicker, but we don't even know for sure if everything's working if you're constantly changing it, because you can't measure it,
Right.
or you can't even just evaluate it. So that does seem like a good recipe for us to try to use going forward. Unfortunately, we don't get to set all of the rules, so I suspect we're going to still have those conversations. But it's helpful to hear what makes it work in your mind when we're talking about reform, and maybe what are some of the pitfalls that didn't necessarily need to be in place when it, which could lead to it not working in some ways. But so, is there anything that, as you were kind of reflecting on this topic, and it's so broad, I mean, I really appreciate you coming in to talk about this, because I know it was on my list of really wanting to do. I want to talk to Chief Bonini. I mean, he's been at the, sitting at the table in really important roles for us during all of these different changes, and just to kind of get your thoughts on it. So I realize it's broad, but I'm guessing I didn't hit some things that, as you were reflecting, that you might want to just share. And I know you're a minimalist by trade, but you've got some thoughts that I probably didn't hit.
Right. Well, you mentioned the last 10-ish years. Again, even beyond that, really going back to 678 in 2009. I think while these were big reforms, there were other little things along the way that occurred, and all of those little things occurred all the while we were still doing our job, our daily jobs, locally. We're still supervising the offenders in the field, and we're still going to do searches. We're attending, 40 hours of training minimum a year. We're qualifying at the range with firearms. We're attending juvenile and adult law update, and we have to stay on top of the reforms that occur in sentencing.
Yep.
And we have probation officers in court, where we have a DA, we have a judge, we have a public defender, but many times that probation officer in court is the one that everyone's looking at to get a recommendation from them based on what the offenders before them or alleged to have done or admitted or was found guilty of, come up with a solid recommendation, and then how do we make that all happen? And many times it could be a young PO that's only been there for a short period of time, but they're expected to know as much about sentencing law as the 3 attorneys in the room.
That's right.
So all of those things are all happening while these bigger pieces of reforms are occurring. Yeah, while the chief maybe, or the chief's management team gets to tackle those big reforms, the others down the food chain and all the way down to the boots on the ground are hearing these things, and it's really incumbent upon that chief to make sure that he or she gets that information down to them and in a way that all of us can understand it, because they need to continue doing the job that they're doing in the name of public safety. And then we need to ensure that we're supporting and doing things with regard to reforms that come forward that, again, are in the name of public safety, and then implementing all of this while it's all occurring at the same time.
So, this whole discussion wasn't to induce more anxiety on my part here. Like, I was like, oh, that's true. It's like, there is a lot. And it's while I've known that to be true, it really is interesting hearing that come through in all of the conversations we've been having as a part of this podcast, because it's partly to really speak to our staff. Really to kind of help arm them with the understanding of these global issues, of these various moving parts. So, I knew this would be a really interesting one for them. And so I really appreciate you spending the time with us today. The final question I wanted to ask, which we're trying to start to ask others as well. If you weren't the chief, what assignment would you want to do right now in the times that we're in your department?
You caught me off guard.
I have stumped Chief Bonini. This is definitely something that's going to be not cut from the podcast.
I think if I had a choice, it would be to deal with, I guess in every county they have this, but deal with post-release community supervision offenders. I'd like to be that officer and have that, because it was something that, as I came up through the ranks, I had a juvenile caseload when I started, and my juvenile caseload was kids in placement. And our philosophy of the chief that hired me was when our county didn't balk it when he used placements, and he felt that if you placed a juvenile, that would be one less juvenile that would commit a crime locally if they did something else. So we were really heavy users of placements, group homes and foster homes. At one point I had 42 kids for a small county like Amador.
Wow.
In placement. And the chief that came in after that chief, his philosophy was different, and we kept kids local and we dealt with them. We ended up getting down to 1 placement in 1 year.
Wow.
Because he said, you guys are bringing these kids home. And we just forced families and the school district and the behavior health and social services, we forced them to really not just necessarily do their job, but we played nice in the sandbox together and developed, and this was before case plans, frankly, were really talked about.
Right.
We were really developing case plans and how to deal with these kids. So I did juvenile, I did every facet of adults, but PRCS wasn't there
after, right?
When I was, it was after I was chief. So I didn't get to experience that. And I have a lot of, when AB 109 came in, looking around my department, I remember, picking the officer that I thought could, do the best job at that. It's changed a few times between retirements, and we try to move officers around. My current officer does a great job. Many times it goes way too far and beyond to try to impact these people's lives in a positive nature, but at the same time understands the yin and the yang, the carrot and the stick, and I think that's really important. So that intrigues me. I always have a lot of contact with him when we talk about what's going on. I even talked to him today, asking him if he thought if there was a policy change with regard to PRCS, a law change, or some resource that I'm missing that maybe I could come up with to help him out. So we talked for about half an hour, and then I headed down here to do the podcast.
Well, I'm going to want to hear what he had to say. That's for sure. But until we know, we won't put it on. Won't put it on blast.
but that would be the thing.
Interesting. Okay. Well, see, I like having a question that I can ask chiefs that I don't know the answer to. So that was a good one.
You didn't give me that ahead of time.
That's the point. Well, thanks so much for spending the time with us today. As always, I really enjoy kind of not only tripping down memory lane on some of these things, but really kind of digging into things and learning about different aspects of the journey that I didn't really know about, and really do appreciate all of your work. It was monumental, continues to be. You're a great leader for our people, and I'm really glad that we got a chance to capture some of your thoughts on the podcast.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you having me.
Great.